So this is the conclusion of the storage box for the pipes I built. This is a little tacky. I have the last coat of finish on there, but I'm fairly happy with how it turned out. I don't have this fully closed because, like I said, the finish is still drying. You can see the dovetails add a nice look to the edges. I put a clasp on there. I don't think that that is in the video. And then inside, this was the main reason this ended up being two parts, was I decided to make these pipe cradles just to have an easy way in order for these to hold when you're not using them. I think they're a nice touch to just giving a pipe. I tried to make the styles of both a little different, kind of like the pipes, and to match the pipes as well. But like I said, that's basically it. This last part will be finishing up the box and showing you how I make these. These, like I said, are really easy to make, and they just kind of set the project off. So where we left off in the last video was I had finished up this very simple veneer work on the top, and then I could just test it in place. You can see the whole box comes apart, and that slides in just the same way the bottom does, and everything fit pretty nicely. Sometimes the rabbets you cut on the edges will be a little too thick and you'll have to plane them down. You could see with the side off how that slides into that groove on the top there. So I marked before I glued this together where I wanted to cut this for the top, so that's what that pencil mark is on the outside, and that's going to be about 1 inch down from the top. So I could take this apart, put glue in the dovetails. I really don't want to put glue on the plywood bottom or the plywood top, because even though plywood is fairly dimensionally stable, the cedar will not be. So as the cedar moves, you want that base and that top to float in those dados and rabbets that you created. It's kind of the point of making those joints. They hide the movement of the box. And even since I put this together, we kind of had a humid spell, so it expanded a little bit, and there's actually some little hairline gaps in the top, and that's exactly what you want to happen. So I just glued all this together, tried to remove as much glue as possible before putting the clamps on. And then I have these strap clamps with plastic corners. These are great for gluing up any sort of box, even irregular shapes. They work pretty well on. And I just put one on the bottom and one on the top. The top one I've lost the corners at this point, but the strap itself works pretty well. So then for the cradles, I just had this is sweet gum laying around. You can see it's about 1.5 inches thick by about 2.5 inches wide. This is actually the piece of material I carved the original pipe out of that I used to make the rest. I just cut out 2 blocks of that sweet gum. Sweet gum looks a lot like maple. And then I just traced the outline of both pipes on there. These are not going to be super intricate. I have some rough shapes. Basically, you're going to just round over the outside and then create a cavity in the center to hold the pipes. I saw these, I was looking, I think it was when I was buying the ferrules for the pipes. I saw a pipe sitting in these cradles, and I just thought it was a really clever idea. For someone who would smoke a pipe. So on this first one, you could see I'm using a Dremel to remove the material. On the second one, I'll show you, I decided to use a hole saw to make this process a little bit faster. But there really was no rhyme or reason to this. Each pipe is shaped a little bit differently, so I was just using the pipe as I went to create a cavity. I wanted these to be small enough to fit in the box, so that also came into play later as I was carving them. I took a little break from that to finish up the box. I took them out of the clamps. There was a little bit of squeeze out, so I just sanded down the corners so that when I rode this on the table saw, it had nice flat surfaces to reference off the table saw. This isn't the final sanding yet. And then, like I said, I'm just lining this up to my mark so that I know I'm cutting below the top. And I'm just going to, this is how you create the top, just cutting a curve through all 4 sides. If you're not careful here, you can actually nick part of the edges, because as you cut all those curves, it wants to move on you, and I usually do nick one of the edges, so you might see that in the box. And then with a scrap of that cedar left over, when I cut those original planks in half, this was the other portion, I just cut that up in order to create 3 compartments inside the box. Really simple. And then I switch back to the pipe. So this is about halfway done. You could see I'm starting to create a nice crevice that this will rest in. And then I just started to go through and make a little bit of a concave portion on the top. Like I said, I tried to make these match the pipes a little bit. So this first pipe is a little bit smaller, a little more streamlined. So that's why the cradle ended up a little bit smaller as well. So all of this is mostly done with sanders, just curving out the pieces. If you have a bandsaw, you could cut these original marks pretty easily. So as I was cutting off the back of this to create more of an arch, I kind of knew I was getting myself into trouble because I was going to be messing with the counterweight of the pipe in there, and I did end up removing too much material. So if you saw in the beginning, that's why there's almost a little bit of this shape sort of becomes a high heel. You'll see later in the video how I do that in order to keep it upright. But I just went through and you could see I'm changing out bits. The bit changes are usually because I have varying degrees of grits, just like sandpaper. So as you progress, you progress to finer and finer grits, so there's not as much sanding to do at the end. These little die grinder bits are usually the bits I use before I start hand sanding, and I'm just cleaning up the outside. You could see I'm testing constantly to see how that pipe fits in the cradle. And then for the second one, I'm not going to show the whole thing because it's a very similar process, but a much faster way I decided to do this one was I removed the bulk of the material where the bowl of the pipe is going to go with a hole saw. So you can see I'm going down about 3/4 of the way through the piece, and then easily remove this material because you basically create a circular kerf on the outside, and you could chip out that inner material. This is a much faster process than using the Dremel. So as you can see, this was the problem when I finished carving this one. It's pretty thin at this point, and that was the problem I had. I could get it to sit in there going the other way, but that just seemed quite counterintuitive. So I just took a little scrap piece, it's just a little triangle. I flattened the back of this to make life a little bit easier. And I just epoxied this little triangle on there. So this one actually does kind of look like a high heel at this point. Just epoxy that in place. And then the next day I could come in and just carve it and shape it a little bit. And that little high heel on the back keeps this one from rocking. So I kind of like the shape of it without the high heel, but like I said, there wasn't much I could do. If I could go back in time, I wasn't going to recreate another one. I didn't hate it that much, but I wouldn't have removed as much off the back. But it was a little bit of a learning lesson for the second one. I didn't have this problem because I messed it up on the first one. You can see I'm just shaping it and feathering it into the other piece to make it fit. And then unfortunately for stuff like this, once you get pretty far into the process, there's really no way around the fact of having to use some hand sanding in order to smooth everything out. And then for this, I'm also putting osmo oil, the same finish as the pipes on these. I just really like this finish. It's very easy to apply. The wood feels spectacular when you apply it properly. I use those white abrasive pads, kind of sands it as it goes almost. That's not to say that you don't have to sand all this stuff beforehand, but in between coats it kind of sands each consecutive coat, and it gives a really nice smooth finish. And then that's how both of those will look. So when I was putting the epoxy on that one piece, I put some epoxy in the corners of the box just because the cedar has very, very wide open grain on the ends. So this epoxy will fill in some of that grain, not because I had huge gaps. And then for this, for the first time ever, I'm using some barrel hinges. These worked out great. They were a little off, I'm not gonna lie, because I use this doweling jig for it, and the problem with this doweling jig is it's only, I think, 11/16. So I had to put these shims on the side in order to use it so it will clamp on center, and my one hole got a little tweaked during that. But you can see I'm using the doweling jig and then some doweling jig pigs to transfer those marks to the top side, and then I could do dowels for the top side as well. Same thing, I had to use these little shims on the side in order to be able to use this jig. This jig works great. I actually really like this jig. and then I could drill my holes. This was the one that was a little off, so I had to tweak it just a bit. And then these barrel pins, barrel hinges have these little screws inside, so there's a flange on the outside, and that screw will go up and widen that flange, so that's how they hold in place. What the nice thing about these are, there's really not a lot of wiggle room. You have to get those holes pretty much perfect, but once they're in place, they're a seamless hardware, which I do really like. So I will be using these again. And then I could just align the top and hammer that into place. And then that's basically how they look. You could see, I'll show it a little bit later. You'll see that the one side is off just a smidge. It's less than a 1/16 of an inch. So all I did with that was I just sanded it down in place. I had enough material on this box that instead of taking the barrel hinges out, plugging the holes with dowels and re-drilling, it was just much easier to sand this one side. That huge gap you see in the back is when I said I nicked the back side of it with the table saw. That's what that is. And then you can screw these in, and it widens that flange, and then they're set in place. For the separators, I didn't do anything crazy. I was just gluing those into place. You can see one side's a little bit bigger than the other because one pipe's a little bit bigger than the other. But this isn't going to be, this storage is for fairly delicate objects. You're not going to be throwing heavy things in here. So all I did was glue those in place. So if you watched the channel a couple weeks ago, I made some planking for a customer. So I'm using that planking to make an inner flange on the lid just to hold the lid in place. It's about 1/4 inch cedar as well. It's already pre-finished because I had it for that customer. And all I did was rip it down to a little over 1 1/8 was what I needed. I rounded over the top so the lid could still close, and then I lined the whole perimeter of the box with that. It's just a nice touch, and it keeps the lid from moving around on you. Just put some glue on those and some brads in place. And then to finish this off the top, I decided to put a very slight chamfer on the top. Chamfers are always a nice way to finish off a piece. I just put that nice final touch on everything. And then Osmo oil is going on this one as well. Like I said, this is a great finish. It's really easy to use. It's somewhat waterproof, and it just really makes the material pop. So I usually put 3 or 4 coats on everything. So the pipes, the pipe cradles, and the box all have 3 or 4 coats. Wipe it on with an abrasive wipe pad, and you really do not want to put a ton on. And anything that's still sitting on the surface after about 10 minutes, you want to make sure to wipe off. Otherwise, it will stay tacky for forever. It'll be gummy. That's basically what the top looks like. And that is essentially the finished box. So that's going to wrap up this series. That's what everything looks like together.